Managerial Accounting, Example 3C. The issue here is what to do when we have a significant amount of spare capacity in our manufacturing facility. So this example, we're spending $1.6 million in overhead. The overhead that we're spending buys us the capacity, the amount of machinery and the other amount of infrastructure that if we had enough orders from customers, we could do 100,000 machine hours worth of work. But we expect that we're only going to have demand for enough products to use 80,000 machine hours worth of work. So how do we treat this 20,000 hours of planned idle capacity? What do we need to do with this? Well, there are a couple different approaches we could take. We could use the actual activity that we expect to use during the year as our allocation base, or we could use the practical capacity. So let's take a look at the differences and what that does. Our first requirement asks us to calculate the company's predetermined overhead rate based on the expected activity. So in this case, we're going to estimate $1.6 million of estimated manufacturing overhead costs as given, and we're going to use the estimated activity of machine hours of 80,000 and so our predetermined manufacturing overhead rate is going to be the $1.6 million divided by the 80,000 machine hours, and we get $20 per machine hour. All right, and this is what we've done the whole time we've been allocating overhead cost. Requirement 2 says to calculate the under or over applied overhead for the year if the expected activity is used and our $20 per machine hour rate is what we have. So to calculate under or over applied overhead, the first thing we have to do is calculate the total overhead applied, which is going to be based on the predetermined manufacturing overhead rate of $20 per machine hour. And we're going to multiply that by the number of machine hours used. In this case, we're told we actually worked 82,000 machine hours. And so the overhead applied is going to be the $20 per machine hour times the 82,000 machine hours, or a total of $1.64 million. So that's the overhead applied. We're going to compare that to the actual overhead spent, and we're told that's $1.65 million. We've applied less than we've spent, so we have under applied overhead of $10,000. And this is nothing different from what we've done in the past. So this is what happens if we use the estimated machine hours that we're actually going to use during the year, or the amount we estimate we're going to use, as our allocation base. We end up being pretty close. The overhead we apply and the overhead we spent ends up being pretty close. There's no adjustment here for the fact that the $1.6 million really buys us an additional 20,000 hours worth of potential work that we know we're not going to use during the period. So let's look at what happens if we do consider the fact that we have 100,000 hours available to us. Requirement 3 says calculate the company's predetermined overhead rate based on practical capacity. We're still going to take the $1.6 million of overhead cost, except now we're going to divide that by the practical capacity, the number of machine hours that we are able to work, which would be the 100,000. And our predetermined manufacturing overhead rate based on capacity is $16 per machine hour. It's quite a bit lower because we have quite a bit of planned spare capacity. Requirement 4 asks us to calculate the under or over applied overhead if this is the overhead rate that we're going to use. So we have to do the same approach where we take our predetermined overhead rate, which in this case is the $16 per machine hour. We're going to multiply that by the actual machine hours that we work during the year. And the overhead applied is going to be the product of these two, or 1,312,000, which is quite a bit different from the original estimate or the actual overhead we spent. The actual overhead spent isn't changed by our different denominator, but we have quite a bit more underapplied overhead. Our underapplied overhead, instead of being only $10,000, is now $338,000. That's quite a bit. It's a bit misleading, though. Not all of it is underapplied overhead in the same way. If you think about why we have underapplied overhead in our case that we've already talked about, it's really just estimation error. We spent a little bit more overhead than we thought, and that was offset a little bit by the fact that we worked more machine hours than we thought. But really the only thing going on there is we estimated the activity for the year a little bit incorrectly. But in this case, we have a big difference between the number of machine hours we use to calculate the overhead rate and the number of machine hours that we use to apply overhead. And again, that was known and in a sense kind of planned because we knew we had a lot more capacity than we were going to use. So requirement 5 asks us to think about this. How much of the underapplied overhead from the prior requirement, requirement 4, was due to planned excess capacity and how much was due to normal estimation error? So what we can do is we can look at the number of planned idle hours. We have capacity of 100,000 machine hours, and we expected to use only 80,000 of those, so we have planned idle hours of 20,000. And we can take our planned idle hours times our predetermined manufacturing overhead rate of $16 per machine hour. And really, the 20,000 machine hours we plan not to use times the 16,000 machine hour is, in a sense, an estimate of our cost of unused capacity. In other words, we knew before the year started that we were going to have excess capacity of about $320,000. Now, this is not a perfect estimate of the cost. A lot of the cost of our overhead is probably based on long-term commitments, and the amount of overhead we're going to use in a particular period is going to be based on that period's particular orders. But we sort of have a sense that in a general sense, we've spent about $300,000 on capacity that we sort of knew we weren't going to use. And our total underapplied overhead was $338,000. So the difference between the $320,000 and the $338,000 is $18,000. And this is really the amount that's due simply to the estimation error. So what we learned from this, requirement 6, what can management do with the information about the cost of planned excess capacity? Management can consider this $320,000 as a cost of capacity that we know we're not going to use. Why is that interesting to us? Well, somebody made a decision to commit to $1.6 million of overhead costs. Somebody made a decision to commit to having a certain amount of capacity available. Now, this could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe in the industry that we're in, we have a lot of rush orders and we need some excess capacity because we don't want to have to turn our customers away if we can't offer them short lead time. So maybe we have to have planned excess capacity. Maybe this is a short-term downturn in our demand, and we expect normally we're going to be closer to 95 or 100,000 hours worth of work. But for a year or two, we're in a short-term decline in our demand, and so maybe this isn't a big deal. We understand what this is coming from. Or maybe we just have too big of a factory. Maybe we have too much capacity, and we need to cut costs, and we need to cut back on the amount of capacity that we have. Okay, we don't have enough detail in this particular example to know which of those is the case, but those are the kind of decisions, those are the kind of things management can do with the cost of excess capacity. Compare it to your strategic plan, compare it to your needed use of capacity and see whether this $320,000 is money well spent because it supports a strategy, or money that's being spent inefficiently and needs to be looked at more carefully.